So without further ado, we will get started. We are going to talk about our agenda for this, hour-long session. So, welcome to everyone. Thanks for having us in your noontime. We'll talk a little bit about OHM, 100 miles. If you haven't interfaced with us before, I'll introduce our presenters today. We'll talk about the uniqueness of coastal Georgia, specifically in the context of kind of our water situation, as water is so important to us here on the coast, affects all things. We'll talk about the broad ecological impacts we have concerns about for coastal Georgia in regard to data centers. We'll do a little bit on conclusions, but the main focus of the end is going to be on actions that you as an individual and as a community can take in regard to data centers. And then we'll leave plenty of time for Q&A at the end. If you have any questions, please do reach out to us through the Q&A function or in the comment section to get those questions to us. So, who are our presenters? It's me. I'm Eric Swanson. I'm the Advocacy Education Coordinator for 100 Miles, and I work to teach people how to advocate for the things that they care about, and speak out for the things that they care about and the way that they want their home and their place that they live to look. So happy to be here with you all today. We also have Alice Kais. I'll introduce her. She's the Senior Conservation Strategist for 100 Miles. Alice is a wealth of knowledge and has been with 100 Miles since nearly the beginning, right? So Alice knows so much and we're very, very happy to have her here today to talk about all things kind of water related and very much give us some really wonderful insights into what's happening at the state level in regard to data centers as well, because Alice is up in the Capitol quite a bit during the legislative session, so she does the Lord's work up there. Um, who are we? So who is 100 Miles? 100 Miles is a conservation organization. We're led by a dedicated staff of 16 and a committed board of directors. We work to help residents and visitors better understand the critical issues facing our coast and then take action to protect it. We wear lots of hats. We like to say we are advocates, we're organizers, we're educators, we're community planners, we're naturalists, we're strategists, and most of all, we're conservationists. We care about the land, we care about the water, we care about the animals and the people that live there. We have this really bold vision. We want to create a future where our coast has thriving communities, protected landscapes, and secure wildlife. And we do this through kind of a three-pronged approach. We work from the standpoint of community engagement, we work from the standpoint of advocacy, and we work from the standpoint of education. And that's why we're doing these issue investigations, is it's a way to work on all those pillars of what makes OHM OHM. So we are in the midst of this webinar schedule. July 30th, we looked at data centers in coastal Georgia and the site and scale of data centers and kind of how that's important. We'll review that slightly today, but if you want to go back and look, that is a hyperlink there. When you get the presentation, you can go back and view that. Um, there are also two more in the series coming up that are going to be more community and human focused on the 28th. And then August 11th will be quality of life impacts on our residents from the standpoint of looking at some case studies of what's happening in Georgia, especially in the Atlanta area. Atlanta is one of our number two areas in the country for kind of growing data center markets. So if you're just joining us, you can watch the webinar here, that first webinar there. That's more for our viewers who are not live with us. Don't stop and watch the webinar and then come back to this because it'll be done and you'll have to wait a while. So don't worry about that. We'll do a quick recap. So what are data centers? The World Resource Institute defines data centers as physical infrastructure of the internet. They house a service network and equipment supporting systems such as cooling, power backup, fire suppression, and security that keep digital services running reliably. That's a big mouthful of words, all to say that data centers are these massive buildings, massive warehouses. They hold the data that make up the cloud and the computing power of the internet and our digital lives. And they need to be kept in specific conditions to remain functional. And that's what we're here to talk about today, how that keeping within those conditions leads to some real intensive consumptive use. So, our citing issues that we covered last issue investigation, data center issue investigation number one, talked about hurricanes and flooding, heat and saltwater exposure as big risks. We also talked about how there's no current data centers on the coast of Georgia, right? The closest one to the coast is actually Statesboro right here, and that's a medium-sized data center. What we're hoping is to think about all of the conditions on our coast as being reasons why data centers might have a hard time coming to this area because of their resource consumption. We're going to jump right into that by talking about hyperscale data centers. So we define data centers in our first presentation, but just to define a specific hyperscale, that's a big data center. They're above 20,000 square feet. They have 5,000 plus servers a lot of times. They have miles and miles of connection equipment, and they require redundancy so that they maintain operation. And that means oftentimes on-site power generation, backup diesel generators, and it's a big facility. So it has a massive footprint. Hyperscale, you think big, right? These can be up to 350 megawatts if we're thinking about a specific example of our Microsoft Fairwater 2 in Fayetteville, Georgia. They're big. They consume a lot of energy. They can be up to, this one is in 1.2 million square feet. They can be upwards of 5 million square feet. And they have these massive campuses that they're on that house the cooling systems. They house the diesel generators. They house a lot of that infrastructure needs that we've talked about. So these are big numbers. These big numbers don't mean a lot. So we try to break it down as, oh, they're, 16 Brunswick Buckies. That's the under roof square footage. They're 7 Walmart Supercenters. That's under roof square footage. They're 21 regulation football fields. That's under roof, just this area, not all of the broader campus that they encompass. And so when we think about this, we give you the context of hyperscale because we're going to be talking mostly about hyperscale today and specifically about the consumption of what a hyperscale data center does. And so I am going to pass it over to Alice. Alice is going to jump in and talk about the aspects of water resources within the state and kind of the ecological impact of a data center on those water resources. Just set the stage. So, Alice, over to you.
Thanks so much, Eric. I don't think I have to remind folks. Well, number one, we appreciate y'all being with us today. It's a pleasure to be with you virtually. And I think I can join any of us who live on the coast by saying we didn't move to the Georgia coast because of the threats that we face. We didn't move to the Georgia coast because of the connectivity that the cloud would provide. We moved to the Georgia coast because our 100 miles is amazing. The ecological opportunities that are here. Within that 100 miles, we have 2,400 miles of coastline, 14 major barrier islands, only four of which are accessible by car. And then we have our river systems, these alluvial rivers that come in from the rest of the state and deposit their sediments, just create this rich environment. And our water is really the interconnectivity of these issues, of why we love this place, of the identity of our Georgia coast. And so it's really that connective tissue. And so as we think about data centers and the explosion of these throughout the state, we really have to consider one of the most important factors that often isn't considered, and that's water resources. Water is, as most of us know, a finite resource, even in areas of abundance. Water is finite, and it requires very careful management to sustain our communities, both wild and human. Most of coastal Georgia, as this map shows, is supplied by fresh water from the Floridan aquifer. And the Floridan is an amazing underground, water source. It's vast, covering about 100,000 square miles from middle of South Carolina throughout all of Florida and the Panhandle, all the way over to Alabama and Mississippi. Um, and this map was created by an entity in Florida and shows where some of the freshwater springs are. And so that's an area where the groundwater is welling up to the surface, and you get these amazing recreational opportunities. You can see that there are no freshwater springs in Georgia apart from Radium Springs near Albany, Georgia, which is really cool. If you haven't visited it, you need to visit. Again, so most major water withdrawals in coastal Georgia are dependent on the Floridan aquifer. It's a very clean, very reliable water source, and any new industry, including a data center, would seek to get water from the Floridan aquifer. One of the things that we wanted to remind folks is that water resources and anywhere on the East Coast and in Georgia here is a public trust resource, meaning that groundwater and surface water are managed by the state for all Georgians. And Georgia's groundwater is a public resource shared by many. This means that basically any entity that uses the resource legally cannot cause unreasonable negative impact on the others around them or any other's ability to use that resource. So in the 1990s, South Carolina and Georgia regulators, along with the United States Geologic Survey, began investigating the cause of salt water that was intruding into freshwater wells at Hilton Head Island. And it was discovered that the problem was largely caused by heavy groundwater pumping from the Floridan aquifer by big industries and municipal water providers in the Savannah area. The pumping was causing a cone of depression, which is a term that our hydrologists use that basically identifies a shift in the pressure gradient between freshwater and saltwater. That allows saline water from the ocean and some very deep saline aquifers to intrude into our freshwater wells that, again, are tapping the Floridan aquifer. So, in response, the state established a series of management plans that and the most significant of the management plans was adopted in 2006 and restricted additional water withdrawals from the Floridan aquifer from the area now known as the red zone. And this map shows you the area of the red zone is identified by political boundaries, which we all know water doesn't follow political boundaries, but regulators have to follow some structure. The yellow zone, there are some restrictions, but there's no restriction in groundwater withdrawals from the Floridan in the area known as the green zone. So this effort, along with a mandate from the Environmental Protection Division for permit holders in the red zone to reduce water withdrawals by 10 million gallons a day has worked. And actually saltwater intrusion threat has been managed in the red zone area with no increases in the amount of saltwater intrusion into the wells in Hilton Head and the surrounding area. So that management plan has worked for now. And the aquifer has actually been slowly rebounding over the past 25 years. And the hope is it will continue to, it is slow, it's kind of snail's pace, but it is certainly working. Interestingly, though, several of the proposed data centers that you'll learn more about are being proposed in areas that are located where there are no additional water withdrawals. And there's no certainty that new surface water sources could support such high demand. Even in areas located in what is in the areas known as the green zone, where water withdrawals are not limited, if a community dedicates upwards of 10 million gallons a day to a data center, it basically forecloses the option to use that water source for future drinking water needs or for actual human needs. So you can go to the next slide here. A report that was released. So again, most water used by data centers is consumed. It's used for, excuse me, it's used for cooling purposes. And so that cooling process basically evaporates off most of the water. There was a report that we read that documented that 60% of the 5 million gallons of water withdrawn for cooling purposes was utterly lost to evaporation. There was a report that was released by the Alliance to the Great Lakes that analyzed just the general trends in great data center growth and the demand on water. And I want to point out a few of the highlights from that report related to some of the alternatives um, that they investigated. We're hearing a lot about these alternative cooling methods that say, oh, well, if we withdraw 5 million gallons or 7 million gallons a day, we're going to return a lot of that water to the area. But in truth, a lot of these alternative cooling methods are not as efficient as they're being touted. And Eric has talked a little bit about these and can talk a little bit more in detail. But liquid immersion is one of those cooling processes where it actually can pose water quality challenges, introducing contaminants to surface water that were not there before. Air cooling uses a lot more electricity and is not sufficient for a hyperscale data center that we're talking about now, that produce massive amounts of heat. And then the reuse and recirculation, or these closed loop systems that some people are talking about, are sound great, but in essence, they build up a lot of byproducts, and it alters the pH of the water so that that reused water isn't usable over a long period of time. Plus, a lot of states are not up to date with their regulations around these, so you might have, a self-regulated industry there. Another issue that we're hearing presented in coastal Georgia is that data centers could purchase water from a public water provider to help generate revenue for utility. But again, in coastal Georgia, the cleanest and cheapest source of water is our Florida aquifer. So it's safe to assume that any new data center will want to drill their own well, get their own permits from the Environmental Protection Division, and process their own water from our shared aquifer. So in short, this is promise of new technology and the promise of revenue generation for local utilities is really not a dependable claim. The reality is that data centers still consume a large amount of water, and can tie up communities' available sources for the long term. Um, so one of the things that we, as what 100 Miles work to do, is to try to establish protections for our communities that are facing industrial development, facing development of all sorts. And so oftentimes we look to the state. And in a situation where, like this, with large water users promising the world to local communities, we want to be able to fall back on protections that are established at the state level. And the statewide water management plan is intended to, was actually adopted in 2008 and was intended to be a guide for local water providers, for industries, for power plants to really predict how water is to be used in the future. The subsequent regional water plans were really designed to bring people together to think about the future of water use. But the plan that was adopted in 2023 for the Coastal Regional Water Management Council was adopted by the Coastal Regional Water Council in 2023. It doesn't even acknowledge the potential of data centers. Not once is a data center mentioned in it. It talks about industrial water users, but part of the purpose of these regional management plans is to identify best practices for all of the entities that use water, to make sure that these water resources are sustainable. Right now, the Coastal Regional Water Planning Council and a new Coastal Permitting Advisory Committee are meeting to discuss these regional plans and policy changes that can be beneficial to sustain our water resources. They're anticipating, though, that that will be released in 2028. So I will put a plug in here. We anticipate another issues investigation around this if y'all are interested in water management in coastal Georgia. So stay tuned for that. But why I wanted to bring this up is that it's evident that this planning structure just can't keep up with the growth and the predatory nature of a lot of the data centers are putting, and the pressure that they're putting on our local and state entities. I also want to bring up the fact that at the state level, our elected officials had many, many opportunities to adopt laws that would have, in some capacity or another, addressed data centers, how and where they're built, how they're financed, and the impact to the energy customers, like those of us who get a bill from Georgia Power every month. 100 Miles and our partners at the Georgia Water Coalition followed all of these bills closely during the session, and we were more than disappointed that of the 20 bills that were introduced, none passed this session. It was very disappointing. All of our legislators were talking about data centers, but none of the leadership just wasn't there to make changes to our state law to protect our our citizens. So it just seems that right now the onus is on local communities to adopt best practices, to codify in ordinances, whether or not you welcome new data centers or heavy industry, that there must be a mandate that practices are put in place that protect the residents of the area, protect the resources that we all depend on for our quality of life and for our health and safety. So I'm going to turn it back to Eric to talk a little bit about the electricity use of data centers and then to carry forward the conversation to what we can do. On to you, Eric.
Thank you, Alice. So we're going to actually zoom out a little bit and we're going to talk about thermodynamics for a while. And that seems like a weird thing to talk when we think about ecological impacts, but it's kind of where we got to and how we got here in regard to the presence of data centers and the threat of data centers to coastal Georgia. And that is that heat is the waste product of computation. And so it requires energy on site at a data center to deal with this heat because we're creating all of this energy um, through that computation, through that data storage. And so you can think about this as being similar to when you have a laptop on your lap and it heats up your lap. It's very, very similar. It's just on a grand, grand scale. And so much of the energy consumption for data centers actually is coming from the need to cool down this heat creation. And as Alice mentioned, there's many ways to do this. But a lot of times it's through evaporative cooling or condensation cooling that is then drawn off, similar to air conditioning. There's many, many new models that are being touted as being really energy efficient, and that's great. And we want that investment to happen. What we need to remind everyone is that when you increase the amount of efficiency through cooled water, what you're also increasing is the amount of power consumption. And in the state of, in the United States, we're seeing that power consumption increase year over year. So in 2023, a comprehensive study was done. It was at 4.4% for the entire US for energy consumptions by data centers. The projection is that by 2028, we will be in the range of 6.7 to 12% of all energy created in the United States will be used to basically power data centers and power the use of data centers. And that's not necessarily all just the computation, it's the cooling the computers that are doing the computation. So that's an important thing to remember. When we think about that as well, we need to think about where our power comes from. So zooming back from the United States down into Georgia, Georgia Power is our largest utility provider. When we think about them as having kind of their creation of their power, where their power comes from, we looked at their website, and their website says that this graph represents all of the kind of energy sources that they have. Many, 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 many sources. Many of them are fossil fuel oriented, especially natural gas and coal that we've talked a lot about in previous issue investigations about how those things relate directly to the release of fossil fuels into our environment, which is problematic in many, many ways. And so, what we are seeing in certain states is that we can think about data centers as an opportunity, and that opportunity is for data centers to invest in more renewable resource and create a more resilient grid by having those investments happen. And so what we would like to see at 100 miles is an increase in solar, an increase in thinking about how do we incorporate hydro or wind on site so that we reduce that big, big energy consumption coming out of fossil fuels. As of right now, because it's happening very quickly, Georgia Power is focusing on natural gas as the main power generator, bringing on new natural gas power plants, or even thinking about creating natural gas systems that are localized to data center build-outs. They also have the kind of unintended effect of creating power through coal-fired power plants that were set to be decommissioned. So those coal-fired power plants are continuing to create power because the demand is so high for data centers. That power generation from kind of an older, dirtier form of power generation is continuing because we can't bring new power sources online as quickly. So that's kind of our state of Georgia sources for power. We will acknowledge that this is an extremely nuanced issue when it comes to power and how data centers consume power. But what we will give is accurate examples of what an individual data center would consume. So in that case, we're going to kind of zoom into an individual hyperscale data center can consume as much electricity as 50,000 homes. And so when we think about regionally, we have many, many small communities that are consuming much less power than what a large hyperscale data center would do. We have very, very, very stringent rules in place for how communities are brought online, how they grow, what rules they operate under. And the level of specificity in the laws when it comes to data centers is not there. And it's not there in a way that really, thinking about a very small footprint, in some cases, much, much smaller than, let's say, 50,000, the footprint of 50,000 homes, but very consumptive. And so what we think about with this is if we planned out a community and we planned out the resources and we had all the laws we had to deal with, we were thinking about how broadly that impact is going to be on kind of all of the communities surrounding. Whereas a single data center can be just as consumptive as 50,000 homes, but not have those benchmarks that they need to meet and those laws that they need to operate under. So just something to think about when we continue on this lesson about kind of the ecological impacts that we're going to typically think about ecological impacts in the umbrella of a hyperscale data center because they are common and they are being built out in the state of Georgia. So, our big ecological concerns for data centers is this big long list. And there are many ecological concerns, there are many impacts. These are the ones that we've highlighted as raising to the top. I'm not going to read all of them out completely, but I will go bullet point by bullet point on the next slides, talking about kind of the impacts of these and some related scientific study about what this could do to the coastal ecosystems around us and have really, really kind of dire ecological impacts. So, the first one, data centers create heat islands that disrupt local ecosystems. So, a recent study published in May of this year found that for data centers in the Phoenix area, raised temperatures in the surrounding area by 1 to 4 degrees on average. And it had spikes under certain weather conditions of up to 9 degrees. And so, what we're thinking about here is that this study is a real study. They were using evaporative cooling at these sites. It was creating a thermal plume. That thermal plume that's coming off the top of the data center was settling in local neighborhoods, and it was affecting those people that live around there. Up to a third of a mile away, they were feeling these impacts. So what we want to think about is, oh, how does that impact the plant and animal communities that live around these areas as well? So as temperature increases, we can see things like blooming in incorrect times of year. We can see impacts on beginning mating seasons at areas and times that are unable to fit with the local weather systems that come in. You would hate to think about this as being a area that is impacted as a heat island where, spring happens earlier in this spot. So when we think about these impacts, we don't want to be um, too forward in our suppositions about what could happen, but we do want to say that there is real scientific data, there are real studies that are showing these increases in temperature happening, and we know that when temperatures increase, especially increase quickly in environment, it can cause a host of ecological impacts. And what I would invite everyone to do is to kind of dive into these scientific papers if you're really interested in one specific ecological concern that we talk about in these next sets. So they'll all be linked in that follow-up email. So heat islands is a big, big issue, not only for human health impacts, but for the impacts on the local plant and animal communities. Our next one we'll talk about is data centers have large footprints with impervious surfaces, increasing kind of runoff and flooding concerns. So impervious surfaces decrease the ability for water to infiltrate into the ground, and they kind of stop groundwater recharge. They increase the volume and the speed of surface runoff, kind of removing that water from that local area and pushing it away. This runoff also carries all of the pollutants that have accumulated directly into local waterways. So we think about when we have massive amounts of impervious surfaces, we have large amounts of runoff. That runoff often gets channeled into local waterways. Those local waterways serve as kind of this repository for all that water. That water can move a lot faster, it can cause a lot of erosion issues and it can cause flooding events. And so a data center might have a fairly, you know, large footprint in an area. It may be placed in an area that's low-lying or a wetland, and it may impact that area by kind of taking that water's ability to absorb slowly and naturally and forcing it off. This can cause issues, especially during rain events and storm events, and cause interruptions in our local amphibian populations. The real impact being that, it interrupts breeding opportunities, it washes out habitat, and it increases the likelihood that pollutants can get into those water systems, affecting the animals that live there as well. So, what we are seeing and what we are seeing with data centers in general is that construction is often handled in a way that minimizes the likelihood of runoff events. Those construction rules go kind of away as soon as the operation of the exact data center comes online. And all those impervious surfaces that are new from parking lots, from all the infrastructure on the site, do have localized impacts, and they are being studied right now. What is always important to note with data centers is everything is so new. With the scope and the scale and the siting of these, that the amount of research that's being done has not reached a publishing date in a lot of cases. Many of the scientific articles we are finding are happening right now, and being, published in 25, 26 as the newest thing and the only thing that's on record, the first of its kind study on data center impacts. So we are really hoping to be as up to date as possible on this and keeping you all up to date as well. One of the big ones that we've been hearing a lot about lately, primarily because of Georgia has a lot of new transmission lines going in that are supporting data centers, is that these designated transmission lines for data centers, which cannot be on local grids, they have to have power coming into them in a specific way. They create fragmentation outside of just the footprint of the center, the developed property. So you think about the power coming into the site, those transmission lines cut through areas. Cutting through those areas increases habitat fragmentation, and it creates barriers between breeding populations. It creates an area where we can have introduction of non-native species and a proliferation of non-native or invasive species. It introduced the microclimates because it basically removes all of the trees from around that transmission line so that the transmission lines aren't affected. So it creates a wide swath of area that is a different temperature and can impede the movement of species from one place to the next. And it does this in a way that often broadly disrupts the migration of individuals within a population, but sometimes even whole populations from one place to the next as they're moving from, let's say, South America to North America. They may run into these large transmission lines as a physical barrier as well too. Think about a bird flying and running into these large lines. They are a physical barrier just as much as they are a swath of cleared land. Um, what we are seeing right now is there's some really good studies coming out of China talking about the impacts of power transmission and transformation projects on kind of the ecological corridors there and how we can kind of extrapolate out a little bit about how their build out of data centers is similar to ours and even more widespread and is being studied. And so they're a little bit ahead of us in their releasing of kind of some of the impacts and case studies on the impacts in China. So it's a really great article to check out if you're interested in kind of broadly how transmission lines parcel out and court separate out habitat corridors and remove kind of populations uh, being able to be connected, which is really, really important for biodiversity. A big one that is hard sometimes to separate out from human health, which we'll be talking about in a later um, data center issue investigation, is noise pollution. We hear a lot about data centers producing noise. It's been one of the main topics that is covered by people when they move into their neighborhoods or nearby schools or communities. We hear about noise. What we also want to remind people of is that noise pollution interrupts animal communication as well, and it can lead birds and frogs and other amphibians to alter when and how they call. It also has been shown to lead to increases in stress hormones in frogs that have been studied around noise pollution sources. So this is a really nuanced issue because there's kind of two different things we're talking about. One is the noise that's associated with the cooling. So these are exterior fans. These are generators. They are creating noise outside of the facility itself. There's also the noise from inside the facility that a lot of times um, isn't insulated enough and it can actually escape from inside the building out into the environment. And these are low level kind of sound waves that do affect animals and actually cause that spike in stress hormones. So what we want to remind people of is that when we think about noise pollution specifically, we do know that noise locally has an effect on populations because they can't hear each other. And if a frog on one side of a data center can't hear the frog on the other side of the data center, those baby frogs don't get made, right? Plain and simple. And so when I think about impacts of data centers, I think about how if we are putting them in areas that are going to have these sort of impacts, we need to think about how we can actively create laws or rules that minimize that noise pollution. And we need to put that onus on the data center operators and the data center developers to increase the likelihood of a decrease in noise pollution, both for human health and for the environment. So, one of the last ecological concerns we'll talk about is that data centers require redundancies that often mean large diesel generators are kind of created as a backup or on-site as a backup, and they create localized air quality concerns. So, as some of you may know, Virginia is a massive has a massive build out of data centers. Those data centers are very big and they are very impactful. And because those impacts are being seen by local communities, many universities are studying them. And Damian Pitt, who I'm going to quote here, is an professor at VCU, and he is quoted as saying that they just completed a study, and something that he was surprised by is to learn that through kind of this process of this long-term study that he was doing. is that you'd almost rather be living next to a natural gas power plant than living next to a whole bunch of data centers. Because data centers, in the terms of total amount of air pollution put out per year, is higher. And that is kind of a wild thing to hear because what we know is that natural gas generation has been used and showed to be an option for data centers to have on-site. They would have their own on-site power generation. What is important to remember is that on-site power generation isn't something that's often disclosed, and that would increase the likelihood of having localized air quality concerns for the communities around that data center. And so it's not just the fact that they are consuming a lot of energy, it's not just the fact that they are creating a lot of evaporative heat through those cooling processes. It's also a possibility that they would be decreasing air quality locally through on-site power generation. So that doesn't always happen. I do want to say that that is not a broad spectrum thing. We can say that all data centers decrease air quality locally because some of them do have off-site power that is brought in. But if you're going to have on-site power, that is an effect. The effect that almost all data centers have is that they have redundancies that create a need for diesel generators on site, and those diesel generators on site, if power interrupted, begin to run and run those data centers. And those diesel generators are not um, regulated in the same ways that large power plants are regulated. And it is possible that those diesel generators continue to run until power is restored. That is a big problem in coastal Georgia when we see that sometimes we have power interruptions within our grid during hurricanes for 3, 5, 7 days. That would mean diesel generators, sometimes upwards of 100 on a single site, running continuously. That does have a very intensive impact on local air quality. So we've done a little bit, and I apologize, doom and gloom with y'all. And we have kind of delved into what we see as some really big concerns and some issues that are kind of, at the moment, insurmountable. We don't know what to do about data centers on coastal Georgia because of all of these concerns. We don't know if they're a good fit. So what we say and what we've been saying is let's press pause on data centers. You've seen this messaging from us in many different scenarios. You've probably seen it broadly in the state of Georgia being used or in other campaigns. Pressing pause means creating a moratorium. A moratorium is a temporary suspension, that's a hard word to say, temporary suspends as a specific government action, and it's during a specified time period. We want those time periods to be quite long, and we want them to be quite long because it requires um, a lot of research and a lot of time to get good rules on the books. So, coastal Georgians, we know need a better understanding of data centers and AI and the impacts, and we hope that we're a small part of that. We also need to have time for engagement to allow local elected officials and staff to have transparent, open conversations. And that's so, so important. And hopefully they're having those with the communities around them. We also acknowledge that we want to set up protections and ordinance to ensure that data centers can be good neighbors if they do come to our areas. And so what is really, really important is to say, this is a new issue, let's press pause. And pressing pause does also allow us to enact some kind of best practices. So we have moratoriums that allow for the creation and adoption of ordinances. And we have kind of a sample ordinance on our website that you can view. We can hyperlink. I showed it in the first issue investigation that can be used by local communities to work with their local government to try and get good ordinance that make those data centers, if they want to come to your area, a good neighbor. You can follow the really amazing model that Nassau County is doing down in Florida and they've created an internal fact-finding community within their local government. and they are working really, really hard as a local government to find out what the impacts would be, data centers would be in their county. And that's a really, really amazing model that we hope to see more adoption of on the Georgia coast. Because what it does is it says it's a promise from your local government that says we're looking into this. Um, if that's not happening as much, we can actually think about grassroots organizations as being a model, and the NAACP has a really great resource for that. It's linked here. And their suggestion, and ours too, is that community advisory boards that are separate from kind of a fact-finding committee can allow for an interface of local community members with local government to kind of work together on what the community benefit agreement from the community to the local government to the data center developer looks like. So using that strategy of kind of laddering up through the process so that your community members have the weight of your local government when talking to those data center developers. And it's really important to think about how community benefit agreements kind of break down all the different levels and allow for you to meet as a group to think about what the impacts are going to be and what we want for our community. So not only do you think about the adoption of ordinances, but thinking about how that ordinance shapes where a data center goes and what size it is and what the impacts may be, but also something as simple as if a data center is going to employ people locally, is there a program to have those employees be local residents and not people from outside with specialized skills? So is there a training program? Is there something that being done that they enrich our community in those sort of ways? So again, we think of community benefit agreements and community advisory boards as these models that are best practices for adopting broadly what you want out of a data center. And if the data center can't comply with that, then they don't belong in your community. And I think that's really important from creating a balanced approach to how we think about if they're coming to coastal Georgia, this is what they should look like. The last thing I'll say,
Eric,
oh, I'm
Eric,
sorry.
if I can just add to that, I want to
Yeah.
really emphasize these big entities can seem overwhelming. And without the guardrails that are in place for other industries, it can feel like you're out there on your own. But the reality is that local voices have power. Grassroots organizing can really make a significant difference in your community. And, 100 Miles is certainly a resource for community members to reach out to. These resources that Eric has put available online are certainly groups and models that can help, but you're not alone if you're fighting this and feel overwhelmed. And so part of the beauty of being able to follow Eric's lead and to talk about these issues is just empowering you with knowledge and information that there are mechanisms for you to make sure that your community grows in the way that you want to grow. We've seen it done before. Many of y'all have been members of ours since the days when we fought offshore drilling. It was the local resolutions passed by every single county on the Georgia coast that then led to the state resolution opposing offshore drilling that then led to Congressman Buddy Carter requesting that Georgia be exempted from being open to drilling off of our Georgia coast. Local voices matter, and it is all really driven by you. So thank you for speaking up. We're here as a resource for you. So sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to
Oh
add
no, that
that a
was
little bit,
perfect,
Eric.
Alice. You summarized perfectly. So thank you for that. Just a quick note, we do have our upcoming webinar schedule. So this is the second in a series of four. Um, what can my community do about data centers is the next one coming up. It's going to talk about broadly that strategy around organizing and kind of include local updates from our coastal advocates that are interfacing with the individual counties and the proposed data centers in those areas or the maybe the rumors of data centers in those areas is a good way to say it. We're trying to keep our finger to the pulse of all of our coastal counties. And then August 11th, again, we're going to talk about the quality of life impacts. So the impacts, the human impacts, and we'll do that through a series of case studies, specifically looking at the Atlanta area, where there is a lot more data centers and there is a larger build out happening, definitely than anywhere other than Northern Virginia. So excited to meet you at those. We do want to let you know, as Alice said, that we are always here to support you, to answer your questions. If you don't want to answer a question during this, please do reach out to us. If you know one of us, you know all of us, and you know me, and so you're connected to all the resources that OHM has. So please reach out. That QR code sends an email directly to me if you're got a burning question you don't want to put on the broader group. Um, for those of you on social media that are joining us or watching not through Zoom, if you are not registered, you can scan here to register to make sure you're updated. And that allows me to be able to send you all those resources that we've been talking about, including the recording and all those links to the studies that we've mentioned. So, questions. We're actually going to jump off of the screen share. And I'm going to pull up questions because they're rolling in. Awesome. So, okay. So someone had a question about DSO. Um, that's in relation to the Georgia 2025 capacity mix graph, that circular graphic that we saw. DSO actually means demand side. So that means that there was generation at a local facility, and that can happen in lots of different ways, but specifically, that's oftentimes solar. And it's on-site solar that's being fed back into the grid a lot of times. So demand side, um, I just forgot about what the demand side though is the first two, and then operation maybe. Um, but yeah, we can get into more of that. It's a little bit of a nuance from Georgia Power's commitment to allow larger entities or even homeowners to create their own power and then feed that back into the grid. Cool. Another question, I'm wondering about the role of the members of the Public Service Commission play in the processes around data center development and power consumption. Can you speak to that? So when we think about the Public Service Commission, it's a group of individuals that are laying out how Georgia Power operates. A lot of times, in that the Public Service Commission is the representative of the people, and they are trying to telling Georgia Power what to do in regards to the Integrated Resource Plan, so the IRP. And we have a new IRP, and that new IRP does kind of lay out kind of what we expect Georgia Power to do. Um, Power consumption in that IRP um, was a major conversation, and the new IRP, um, to summarize, um, does allow for a build out of more power generation because data centers are going to be a large consumer and a large basically a large client of theirs. And so when we think about power consumption, much of the power consumption that is happening is not for residential customers, it's actually for these data centers. And so we hope that when we think about um, that amount of increase in power generation, that the speculation is not just solely the data center bubble, possibly, because if the bubble burst, then we've built out much, much, much more power generation and continued using older technology to create power rather than investing in newer technology for power creation. So I
Yeah.
hope that answers it. But Alice, if
Eric,
you have anything.
yeah, I'll add just a little bit to that. That was a good description of the role of the PSC. In December, I think, of last year, the PSC approved 10 more gigawatts of power to be
Hmm.
generated by Georgia Power to support data centers. Part of some of the legislation that didn't pass this year was related to how Georgia Power is going to offset the cost of those increases. And so, again, since none of the legislation passed, the PSC just, I think this week, no, earlier this month, agreed to investigate how Georgia Power was going to be offsetting the cost of this massive expansion that they anticipate doing with the extra gigawatts needed to support these data centers. So that was just released. That announcement was just made earlier this month that they're going to be investigating. But what they do
Hmm.
with that information is really unknown. So we hope they, again, protect residents and protect businesses that don't aren't requiring these massive investments.
Awesome. Another one question is, do heat islands increase the risk of wildfires in those localities? What we want to say is that this area does need more study. The Phoenix study did show that increasing in temperature in these localities, and to back up, the Phoenix study was really amazing. They actually had these really, really cool temperature gauge that they actually mounted on vehicles, and they moved those vehicles around the local area, and they actually measured the temperature fluctuations in those areas compared to a certain distance away. And so using that data center as a central point, they move farther away, and they actually measured the temperature in the area, and they saw those increases. What we know is that as temperature does increase, we do have more evaporative effects. Those evaporative effects dry things out. Drier areas increase fire risk. That's the only thing I can say about that. We
I
can
like
have,
I,
yeah,
I like to think of it as adding man-made drought to
yeah,
natural drought because we know
ex
drought is going to happen, but when we decrease the amount of water in the area, or we heat up an area, then we're adding man-made drought conditions to existing drought conditions when they occur.
awesome. So, there's a question about what sort of protections from data center impacts are already in place along the Satilla River. That is a great question. I don't know personally of any. I know that there are people with better knowledge about the Satilla River broadly, and that massive kind of watershed. When I think about the Satilla River and kind of all those things that are connected, I think about the fact that we don't have a data center now, but what would that data center do with kind of the water it impacted, and how would it be connected to the Satilla River if they came in? So, is there surface water withdrawals for their water? Possibly, right? What does that look like and what are those impacts? Are there impacts for discharge of water? What does that look like? So that's a big question mark on our end. If you are I don't have your name, but if you would like to send us an email directly, we can talk more in depth on that. Maybe connect you to our good partners at the River Keepers. But as of right now, there is no data center impacts that I'm aware of, unless it's farther upstream from our coastal counties, which for the Satilla wouldn't
Yeah,
be anyone
Er- yeah,
that
Eric,
I know
I'll
of.
also add that the Satilla River corridor is one of the major wildlife corridors that's identified in the Georgia State Wildlife Action Plan because of the protected species that it supports. And so I think, going back to your ecological considerations that you outlined, threatened and endangered species that would be impacted by, a massive footprint of a building and the runoff created, loss of habitat for maybe the swallowtail kites or other aquatic species that are in that area would certainly be would need to be on the list of things investigated should a data center continue to move forward. And we know that Brantley County already is considering those. We'll learn that more about that next time.
Yeah. The question here that, and we do have so many questions, so I do know we've gone over an hour, but we're going to try to answer these as quickly as possible, and then reach out directly for those who might need more of an in-depth answer as well. The question says, would laws require disclosing on-site power generation be something that would have to happen in the legislature? That could happen through your community benefit agreement. You can create basically requests to the county. The county can put that into law. That developer would then have to disclose their full plan before they have approval and before they start applying for permits to build. And so that's part of a community benefit agreement. That's part of a good ordinance for sure. Alice, anything to add to that? Okay. Um, there's another one here. Have there been any studies on or examples of data centers and natural disaster recovery? Not to our knowledge. I'm sure there are going to be scenarios as we look forward towards this, upcoming hurricane seasons in the future. Because if you look at the data center maps, and we can provide those to you, um, especially in the Northeast, which we think of oftentimes as not super hurricane prone, but recently we've had more storms happening in that area. There are many, many coastal communities that have data centers in the Northeast. And so that will be a definitely um, a study area for the possibility of that happening. We also have a large amount of data centers in Florida as well, and around the Gulf Coast, Alabama, Louisiana, and we know there'll be impacts there from hurricanes in the future. So I guess too soon to tell from my knowledge, but we can look and see if we can find anything that's been published so far. Anything on your end, Alice, on that one? Is it
No,
just too early?
I was just thinking of a study that looked at data center capacity that was at risk because of climate challenges and flooding and other hazards that would certainly be elevated in coastal areas like coastal Georgia. But that's that from an existing capacity standpoint. But I can certainly go back and try to find that again and post it for everybody.
Awesome. Yeah, we can look for that in the resources that we pass on to y'all. Um, a question about, can a municipality pass a moratorium at any time, even if an ordinance is already in place? The answer is most county commissions can do kind of whatever they want to, as long as they have buy-in from the commissioners and they have a vote on it. And if they ask for a moratorium and it gets a vote and everyone says, or a majority says they're willing, then yes. Ordinances. Um, would not necessarily stop something that is our a moratorium would not necessarily stop something that's already in place or being built and been approved. That would take another type of action, but it can stop future builds. If you want to have a better ordinance on the books, then definitely a moratoria is what to do. Moratorium allows for that creation and allows for that adoption to happen without any pressure from a developer trying to build while you don't have something out there that would support what you want as a community. Anything additionally on that, Alice? No. Cool. Awesome.
That's all good.
And then we got two more. We've got, what type of environmental pressures are involved in planning and permitting data centers? Um, so that is up to the county. A lot of times, if they are bringing in outside professionals to um, basically consult on what their ordinance looks like, what their kind of impacts are going to be that they don't want, how you kind of get the rules on the books. Um, when we think about planning, I think Alice is probably best suited to talk about that, or not, I'm sorry, not Alice. Hannah is best suited to talk about this, who is our planner on site. So I can pass this um, question on to her and she can speak with you through email. But um, what I do know is that when we think about permitting for data centers, we do think about that consumption, and they do have to be fairly forward about what their consumption is going to be from an electricity and water standpoint. And those permits then do come from the EPD, especially in regards to water. So they have to say how much, if they're going to draw from the aquifer, they have to say how much, and they can't go over that permitted amount. Um,
Yeah, and I can add that there are individuals that specialize in data center permitting and planning, similar to the process we went through with the Camden County Spaceport. There were national experts that were brought in to advise the supporters of construction of a spaceport in Camden County about the specifics of what that would look like, and they were very good at really appeasing some of the concerns and questions that people had, because their job was to make sure that that facility was built. And so I think that with the data center explosion, that there are some companies out there that are really, really pushing and really, really good at finding the path of least resistance for both the permitting from the state level, but also the siting at the local level.
Awesome. And then kind of our last one, and I appreciate you all sticking around. And again, reach out directly if you have more questions. You have my contact information. But last and not least is zoning and land usage needs to happen with community involvement, and we agree on that. Has there been a discussion around starting a data center community advisory board akin to the historic review board in Savannah? Um, Yes, there are conversations happening. Many of those are county specific because our counties are so different. We do have a real desire to think about having a broader coastal approach to data centers, and we are in discussions with partners and community members about what that would look like. What we would like to say as 100 miles, though, is that we do want to be a resource to empower local communities. And much of the time, your local county is going to listen to mostly its residents. And so sometimes a broad group has sway and power, but the real effective change happens in that local community, in that county. And so, grassroots organizations in those local places and going to the meetings and engaging is really important. And we have resources to help you with that. We have local coastal advocates to connect to you to, and we have trainings on how to speak at those meetings and how to be most effective with your comments as well too. And that's a resource that I'm happy. It's my job. I'm happy to connect with you on. So, not yet is the big answer. Maybe question mark, but we do advise people to be organizing in your local communities, in your local counties, as that seems to be the most effective when we think about data center policy because it's not happening at the state level or regional level. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I know we ran a little bit over, but I appreciate your eyes and ears. We will be sending a follow-up email with all those resources we mentioned, and have a great rest of your Tuesday. And join us in 2 weeks on the 28th for a further continuation webinar number 3, Data Center Impacts on Coastal Georgia. Bye, y'all.